Oh, hello, and welcome to another fun filled edition of the Saturday's version, the Saturday stream of Adam's Music Box. So, today I want to talk about musical memory, and I'm not talking about your ability to memorize a musical composition. I'm talking about the the potential and the propensity of music fans, of music listeners to remember the music and the legacy of various artists who are of the past, meaning they are no longer alive. In this instance, let me see if I can do something about that. Um, hey, I guess that's better. Look, low fidelity, folks. Listen to the music in hi-fi, but when it's just someone speaking, the lo-fi will do. We're bringing back AM radio, people. So musical longevity, and what got me thinking about this was the recent and sad death of Ozzy Osbourne, a man with a prolific career in a style of music that, while ubiquitous, was never at the forefront of popular music. I mean, in 1971, the Carpenters were more popular than Black Sabbath, and in 1983, Thriller was more popular than, let's say, Diary of a Madman. But nevertheless, heavy metal was a huge part of the popular musical culture of the 70s, 80s, and even beyond. And this got me thinking about the overall history of what makes a musician beloved and remembered after his or her death. And a very interesting concept that I believe to be absolutely true came to mind. All of the things that we tend to criticize about the music industry, mainly the industry part, because we're not here to criticize the music, we're here to praise the music. But the industry part, we know all the bad things about the industry, the way it cheats artists, the way that it promotes some mediocrities over some virtuosi and that sort of thing. But at the same time, we do owe a lot to this monster that we feed called the music industry. And we've owed something to it for a longer time than we would think. As music listeners, as music lovers, or even as music historians, we have necessarily a love-hate relationship with the music industry. And to understand why, we need to travel back in time to the 17th century and the 18th century. Let's start with the 17th. Let's start with the era of Bach, a man who is known today and who has been known for several hundred years, I would say 200 years to be specific, as one of the finest composers, one of the most important innovators, one of the greatest harmonizers. His harmonic compositions and what he did with counterpoint, absolutely brilliant and as modern sounding in many ways today as anything that was done in his time. Now, why do I say 200 years when Bach is older than that? Well, I say that on purpose because when Bach died, he was forgotten almost instantly. And even in his own lifetime, he was known around Leipzig as a great church, a great liturgical composer. But apart from the areas around Leipzig, he wasn't this pan European, let alone international superstar that he became after death. Now, keep that in mind, and we'll go back even further in time to Vivaldi, a man who was known in his time and in his place, but totally forgotten for centuries after his death. Let's now go to the 18th century, because there are a lot of 18th century composers who were known in their time that are more or less completely forgotten today. There were people, for instance, does the name Johann Adolf Hesse mean anything to you? Well, it would have meant something to people in the 18th century. Antonio Salieri, completely forgotten, and his name was really only resurrected not even by music listeners, but by music historians, who were people that then resurrected his name in the context of his strange relationship with Mozart. Luigi Boccherini, another forgotten name. And then there are some other names from the 18th century that were forgotten by most of the 19th century. Haydn, for instance, he was remembered among music historians and musicologists, but he was generally forgotten and unloved by 19th century music audiences. The same is true with the earlier Handel. Now, why is it that when we get to the 19th century, the musicians, the composers, the conductors who were popular then tended to be popular forevermore? Well, was it because music got more sophisticated? Yes. Was it because music got more professionalized? even a bigger yes, because something needed to fund the professionalism. Professionalism means two things. There's the literal definition, which means you pay for something, as opposed to amateurism. So if I'm an amateur, I get drunk, pick up a guitar, and play at a pub. And if I sing out a tune and if I break a few strings, who cares? Because I'm just there for the fun of it. A professional goes to, the local bar, and the owner says, right, I'll pay you X amount of money to play X amount of songs in this style of music, and you can only take a 5-minute break. Sounds a bit less fun, and it is in some ways, but the end result is a higher quality of music because someone has skin in the game. And that's what happened to the world of art music, as it was really referred to at the time, or classical music, as it became referred to in the 20th century. That was what happened in the 19th century, the increasing professionalization of European classical music, where you had full-time orchestras with a full-time budget being led by incredibly skilled conductors who trained and studied and who were given the oral history through their predecessors of the great European musical tradition. And as a result, the concert halls got bigger, the acoustics got better, the appearance of the concert halls became more beautiful because, at that time, before the financialization of the economy, you did to some extent still get what you paid for. And in the music industry, this really paid off. Now, in terms of the consumer, how are they funding this? Well, one was ticket sales, because it was the 19th century when the great classical musicians left the chamber of the great aristocratic manors and stately homes, and they entered the grand concert halls, where you weren't being paid a huge sum of money to play in Lord so-and-so's house, but you were being paid a lot of little bits of ticket sales, 1,000 people all paying a nominal fee to go and watch you play. And the person most responsible for this democratization of music in the 19th century was also one of the great composers and conductors of all time, the father of modern conducting. You could also maybe call him the father of romantic music, along with Beethoven, who bridged the gap between the high classical period and the romantic period. I'm talking, of course, about Richard Wagner. And I've done videos on this before, on all of the changes Wagner made to professionalize conducting, orchestral playing, operatic setting, concert halls, opera houses themselves. He turned it into a very successful business. And it was the business of selling great art at a high level, but sold to the masses. Now, around this same time, another great phenomenon came about that created other revenue streams that helped to professionalize music composition. And this was sheet music, which between the 1830s and the 1920s was an ever growing industry, and in fact, the biggest source of revenue for the music industry. That is where the music industry began. There's always been music, but it was during the sheet music revolution that the industry part of it came into things. And the end results were very good for music. The music got increasingly interesting. There was more innovation. You would go to an orchestra by the 1870s and 80s expecting perfection, where in the early 19th century, in Beethoven's era, you had amateur or semi-professional orchestras that frankly were not good enough to play Beethoven's music, something that Wagner really fixed. He rectified that in his own lifetime. Now, in this era of professional conductors, you had so many greats. You had Wagner himself, you had Hans von Bülow, you had Arthur Nikisch, you had Ferdinand Löhr, you had Hans Richter, all of these great conductors from this Wagnerian tradition who understood that at the essence of European music, European classical music, is the fact that unlike almost any culture's classical music in the world, rhythm is subservient to melody and harmony, and the rhythm must follow where the melody and harmony takes it. This is the opposite of, let's say, the Indian raga, of the Indonesian gamelan, of the master drumming of West Africa, where rhythm create with rhythm is the foundational lodestone on which all other things are built. In European classical music, it's the opposite. And these great conductors of the Wagnerian tradition truly understood this, and they created a highly professional but still very spiritual and culturally rooted oral tradition, whereby things that you could never necessarily write down with ease, although Wagner did a really good job of writing it down with comparative ease, but orally, these traditions, these concepts were passed down through the ages and became more professionalized and more, beautiful to the audience, more emotive to the audience as a result throughout the 19th and into the early 20th century. Now, other inventions were soon to come along which helped preserve musical memory, namely the player piano and player organ, other player instruments of the late 19th century, recording, which, while it began much more primitive than the player piano, by the 1920s, you have electronic recordings, which were, especially for their day, pretty damn good. And you had radio becoming incredibly popular at this same time. Now, what did that mean for musicians and composers and people, music makers, the, creators, as we call them today in the beginning, or as the end? It meant that you never really had to die. Ooh, spooky. But no, this isn't the Art Bell radio program. What I mean by that is when you have a record that has been mass produced, and I don't mean a record as in an LP, I mean some sort of physical document of what happened, then you never really have to die. Because in the golden age of sheet music, you had homes throughout the world that had pieces of paper on them that said Beethoven and Schubert and Schumann and Liszt and Wagner and Strauss and Bruckner and all of these other household names in this European tradition, who are now household names in places like China, Japan, Korea, and India as well. Where before this era, a lot of musicians, not a lot, most musicians, when they died, the memory, the public memory, the collective consciousness, if we're going to get Jungian, that died with them. And that was true of Bach. It was true to a great extent of Handel. It was true of Vivaldi. And it was true of a lot of those musicians from the 18th century I mentioned earlier, who were even more forgotten. Now, I can hear what you're saying now. I know who Bach is, you son of a bitch. Well, yes, you do. And there's a reason for it. In rare cases, the musicians who were dead and forgotten were revived in the age of the great music industry. Bach's first revival came in the 1830s, at the beginning of the golden age of sheet music, and he was revived by Mendelssohn. There were several other Bach revivals throughout history because he came and went, ebbed and flowed through popularity throughout that point. But once you resurrected him in the era of professionalized orchestras, professionalized conductors, and mass printed, mass produced sheet music, you were brought back to life. Much like Walt Disney in his magical, tube thingy, you can be brought back to life, because once it's printed, once there's a piano roll for a player piano, once there is an Edison cylinder, once there is an electric or acoustic recording, once there is a magnetic tape, now we're into the 30s and 40s in Germany, then you never die. And that is why Beethoven in the classical world has never been forgotten. Same with, Schubert, Schumann, Liszt, Wagner, Bruckner, Strauss, all of the greats, the titans of this 19th century tradition. And I'm focusing on Germany, but you could say the same about Berlioz and Bizet, and later on Debussy and Ravel. In France, you could say the same of people like Elgar in England, of Grieg in Norway, of much later on Sibelius in Finland, of Tchaikovsky, Rimsky-Korsakov, Mussorgsky, Borodin, Balakirev in Russia, later on Scriabin. And so what did all of these people have in common? Well, musically, they were all very different. I've done videos on that, but they all came of age either at the beginning or at the height of a very powerful music industry, whether in publishing of the sheet music, whether in recording, whether in the player piano rolls, or all of this type of thing. And so when some composer is rediscovered and brought back to life, he too can achieve immortality. It's what happened with Vivaldi in the 20th century. Just as Mendelssohn brought Bach back to life, a lot of musicologists in the 20th century discovered this guy writing about the four seasons. And hey, he's older than Frankie Valli by a lot. And so they brought him back to life, and living he will remain, because this resurrection took place in an age where the music industry was very powerful. And so, while it will always remain true that musicians in their own lifetime will get, the priority over the dead, at least most of the time, when it comes to classical music, you never really have to die. And we'll get to pop music in just a second, because something happened to classical music round about the time of the Second World War. There was a concerted effort by critics, many of which originated from Vienna around the time of the First World War and a bit before. And these critics were determined to reverse the populist democratization in music that Wagner and his acolytes had pushed. His music, Wagner's, was sophisticated but accessible. It was big and it was beautiful. It wasn't a bill, though, but people had to pay money to get into the show. And so by the turn of the 20th century, a small movement in Vienna, which then relocated to the United States, wanted to depopularize classical music by making the sounds ugly, for lack of a better word. Now, I'm not one of these people who throws out the modernist baby with the bathwater. I've done videos about how Scriabin was a proto-modernist, who in many ways was more modern than his successors, about how Bartok and Kodaly were wonderful musicians, about how Khachaturian was able to combine populism and modernism in the heart of the 20th century. But in general, the great classical composers of the post-romantic age, the ones who wrote beautiful music, they were driven away from the concert hall and opera house by these critics and so-called academics, and they were driven into things like radio orchestras and film scoring. That's where the populist orchestral music went. And so while we today can go to Spotify and listen to the most obscure modernistic sort of orchestral or chamber music you want, their memory does live on, but not in the same way that Beethoven and Wagner do, because there was a concerted effort to say that, look, now that we have all this technology, maybe we should actually work against it. And a communist who I seriously dislike, called Theodor Adorno, well, technically he's a revisionist, he was someone who helped to promulgate this theory. The essence of trying to de-democratize music, which reversed this major trend. But Adorno did not have the lost laugh, because in the late 19th century, round about the time of the invention of recorded sound, and I would say more importantly at the time, the player instruments, so you had the piano rolls and the organ rolls, pop music got invented. So right when classical music started the long road to becoming less populist, you had a music where populism is literally baked into the name, popular music. Now, I've said this before, but I think it bears saying again. Well, what is pop music? Well, when you take folk musicians, people who would play in taverns and saloons and village squares and markets and things like that, and you increase their budgets and therefore allow them to become professionalized, you get pop music. And as a result, localism in terms of folk music tended to give way to a more regional or eventually international style of pop music. From the great ragtime composers of the late 19th century to Michael Jackson and beyond, pop music, because of the industrial aspect of the music industry, allowed entire regions, entire continents, and eventually the entire world to become familiar with the same music. Now, why do I say ragtime? Ragtime was a style of music that predated the player piano, but it reached its zenith of popularity around the time of the player piano. And before that, it was a growing musical style in this age where sheet music was this huge moneymaker. And so you could buy a ragtime song, or you could buy a Beethoven sonata, take it home with you, and try to play it. the music industry at work. And I have to give another shout out here to someone who I've mentioned before, and he's a great pianist, composer, singer, songwriter. He does it all. His name is Foundering, and he right now is going through all of this digitized, now it's digitized sheet music from the late 19th and very early 20th centuries. And he is doing what no one has done before, which is attempting to record every major ragtime pop song, because it was pop music and the style of pop music at the time was ragtime and its derivative genres. And he is trying to record as many of them as he can, because these songs were just on the cusp of recorded music technology. But because recorded music was still in its infancy, while the sheet music industry was at its height, all of these songs were printed. They were sold. You could buy them at a department store. You'd go into Wanamaker's in Philadelphia, for instance. You'd hear a man playing the organ. Maybe he'd be playing some classical, some light classical, some ragtime. And then you could go, next to the shoes and the cufflinks and, the parfum, and you could find the sheet music. And he is using the digitized sheet music from archives all over the world to recreate this. Now, the story of pop music, contrary to what a lot of naysayers say, I say is one of increased musical sophistication and professionalism. It's the kind of thing where, if you want to paint two really huge contrasts, you go from, let's say, the very early 19th century, before the professionalization of music as such, before the industrialization is a better word of music, and you'd have folk musicians, amateurs, playing for their own entertainment and those of the people around them, drunk or otherwise. And then you get to 1979, where you have the guys in Toto, incredibly professional musicians playing in the pop arena, but with the kind of musical training and virtuosity that would have been unknown even among early 19th century classical musicians. So, for instance, you take the studio musicians of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s in a huge session musician town like LA. And you compare them to the people who played in Beethoven's orchestras in the early 19th century. The guys in Toto were better musicians. That's not to say that Africa and Beethoven's Ninth are the same. I personally love them both. I think maybe Beethoven's Ninth had a bigger influence on the history of European music, but hey, I love it all. But the point is, virtuosity increased with the industrialization of music. So for all that Luddites talk about how the industrialization of music killed folkish traditions, killed local traditions. And I'm not saying that's good. It is sad because we did lose something, but we also gained something, both in classical music in the age of Wagner and in pop music, which continued to become more sophisticated and more technologically refined from the late 19th century onwards. We gained a lot. Not least, we gained the democratization of music, whereas in the 18th century, the most popular music was played behind closed doors. It was played for the aristocrats, for heads of state, for clergy, not for regular folks like you and me. By the 80s, anyone could save up and buy a nice stereo system and put on any record you want, whether Toto or Michael Jackson or Ozzy Osbourne or ABC, and listen to high fidelity recordings of talented musicians playing music that had been rehearsed a lot and perfected in a highly professional, very costly music studio. And so let's bring things forward to 2025 and the death of Ozzy Osbourne. And we hear this, there's this old phrase, well, rock and roll will never die. It has died in the sense that it hasn't been the main musical language of pop music for around 20 years. Some would say 25. In that sense, it's died. It will never die in the sense that Beethoven will never die, and Frank Sinatra will never die, and Enrico Caruso will never die, and Bing Crosby will never die. And thanks to people like Foundering, ragtime will never die because it's there to be resurrected, because it came about in this age where everything is memorialized on some sort of document. Today we memorialize it in the cloud, but it's still a non-fungible, or at least semi-non-fungible document, memorialization of the music itself, or at least a part of it, whether it's the performance or simply the notes on the page. At least you've got something to work with. And I would argue that, right, in 50 years from now, will Ozzy Osbourne be as popular as he is today? No. But will there still be people listening to Ozzy Osbourne? Will there be people putting on leather jackets and going to people doing tribute concerts to Ozzy Osbourne? I would say absolutely yes. Look at jazz. Everywhere in, well, jazz hasn't been at the center of the pop music world, arguably since the age of the big band, or maybe more appropriately, since the age of classic pop in the early 60s, when that gave way to a more rock and roll derived pop music. You still have various kinds of jazz clubs in most big cities throughout the world, and sometimes people dress up to it. They wear the clothing associated with various eras in jazz. The same way, we're 50 years from now, if we haven't all blown each other up, we'll have people wearing the leather jackets and the chains and going to a Black Sabbath tribute band. In the same way, 50 years, whether in Chicago or Paris or in China, you will have people playing Beethoven. And so, what does all of this mean to us? It means that we have so many options, we have so much democratization in music and of music, that no one ever has to fade from popularity. They might fade from the center stage, they might fade from the spotlight, but they'll never fade from the ability to be loved, to be enjoyed, or to fall out of favor and then be relatively easily rediscovered. And I think that is, for all of the many, many problems with the music industry, this is the good part. And if you want to really make it even more granular, the bad part is the accountants and the lawyers and the executives who think they know better and then screw the musician out of his or her hard earned money. That's the bad part. The good part of it is that it has been able to finance technologies that make the music immortal, whether the technology is a magnetic tape, before that an acetate, before that a cylinder, before that a mass-produced piece of paper made by a modern electromechanical or mechanical printing press. Today it's streaming. It's having all of this storage space in the cloud, the great cloud in the sky, man. It's all of those things. It's the invention of film. We can now see what the musicians look like performing their music. It's the invention of videotape, which made visual capture even more portable eventually. It's the iPhone, which now things have come full circle, and that the street musicians, the modern folk musicians of their day, now even they are becoming memorialized, because unless you get censored for saying too much truth, that video you uploaded 15 years ago of a guy playing guitar outside of Union Station on Facebook will probably still be there. So if you're one of these people who have uploaded those videos, try not to say any political truths, because we don't want Mark Zuckerberg to take our music away from us, or something similar. So again, the technology has become so ubiquitous and so comparatively cost effective that everything has come full circle. And it just goes to show that, much as the record terms, what goes around comes around. So thank you to the industrial and technological aspects of the music industry, because it means nobody will have to die, but your health insurance premiums will have to go up, unfortunately. As always, like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.